You begin with the glitter of the stage lights, the roar of an arena filled with fans, and a voice that seemed destined to define the 1990s. This is R. Kelly, the R&B superstar whose song soared to the top of the charts, whose collaborations with icons shaped an era, and whose ballads became the soundtrack to graduations, weddings, and late-night radio dedications. But as you lean closer, the shine dims. Beneath the rhythm and smooth harmonies lies the dark secret that would eventually unravel everything. His name, once synonymous with talent, is now forever tied to betrayal, manipulation, and crimes that shocked the world. This is not just another celebrity downfall. It is a story of ignored warnings, silenced victims, and decades of unchecked abuse. And tonight, you're going to hear it told in the quiet hush of midnight, where the truth becomes harder to look away from. Welcome to 102 Hours, your late-night corner for true crime and mysteries. I'm glad you're here, even if the subject is heavy. As you settle in, let me guide you through the unsettling story of a man who turned fame into a weapon. Before we dive in, take a moment, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always like to know where you're listening from as we unravel these stories together. And if you're new here, make sure you tap subscribe and give this video a like. It helps this community of night owls grow. Now, lean back, breathe deeply, and let the calm of the night balance the weight of what we're about to unfold. Because R. Kelly wasn't just a musician, he was a phenomenon. His breakout in the early 1990s was meteoric, with his debut album 12 Play establishing him as the king of R&B slow jams. His collaborations with Michael Jackson, Jay-Z, and Celine Dion weren't just hits, they were cultural landmarks. And when he wrote I Believe I Can Fly, the song became more than music. It was an anthem played at school graduations and Olympic ceremonies. From Chicago street corners to the Grammy stage, the narrative looked like a classic American dream realized. Yet, even at the height of his fame, troubling signs flickered. Rumors about his behavior with underage girls swirled in his hometown of Chicago. Industry insiders whispered, but few dared to speak publicly. It was easier, safer to let the music drown out the noise. You find yourself asking, how could someone so celebrated carry such darkness unchecked? The answer begins here, with the paradox of stardom itself. Fame shields as much as it exposes, and for R. Kelly, the spotlight became a perfect hiding place. While millions memorized his lyrics, those closest to him noticed patterns. The entourage of young girls, the sudden disappearances, the way he seemed to groom loyalty through charm and control. Investigators still question whether the industry, enamored with his talent and profits, deliberately looked the other way during these early years. It wasn't just fans who overlooked the rumors. Journalists chasing stories often encountered walls of silence, with record labels protecting their star and lawyers quick to threaten litigation. This is where history intersects with his story. The 1990s were a golden age for R&B, with record sales breaking into the billions and artists wielding more cultural power than ever. For executives, Kelly wasn't just an artist, he was a cornerstone of profit. And so the whispers remained whispers. But here's a quirky detail. Even as accusations simmered under the surface, Kelly's songs often contained cryptic hints of his real-life obsessions. His fixation on youth and innocence bled into lyrics and visuals, often brushed off as artistic metaphor. Fans would later revisit those works with a chilling realization. What sounded romantic in the moment felt predatory in hindsight. This strange intersection of art and reality added to the unease, raising questions about how much the world had missed hiding in plain sight. By the late 1990s, Kelly's success showed no signs of slowing. He produced hits for other artists, dominated award shows, and cultivated a near-mythic status in Chicago, where he was seen as both a local hero and a self-made millionaire. But behind closed doors, a darker empire was taking shape. The very same city that celebrated him as a hometown star was also where police files began to accumulate. complaints, rumors, and early investigations that rarely went anywhere. Victims' families sometimes reached settlements, choosing silence over the public battle against a beloved figure with endless resources. You notice a pattern here. Power buys silence. Money builds walls. And in this case, those walls held for years. But the cracks were already forming, and soon the private whispers of Chicago would become headlines read around the world. For now, though, you're standing at the edge of R. Kelly's rise, the glittering peak of his career. From the outside, he was untouchable. From the inside, a storm was gathering. And as you drift deeper into this story, you'll see how that storm grew, why it took decades to break, and how the music that once lifted spirits now carries the weight of crimes too serious to ignore. You step back to the mid-1990s, when R. Kelly's fame was skyrocketing and his reputation as a musical genius seemed unshakable. Fans adored his voice, his stage presence, and his ability to blend gospel, R&B, and hip-hop into something uniquely his. Yet, at the very same time, troubling signs were surfacing. Quiet stories that never made it past the edges of his empire. You begin to notice how these early warnings, if taken seriously, might have stopped years of pain. Instead, they were brushed aside, lost in the noise of platinum records and sold-out tours. The first warnings came from those closest to him. Neighbors in his Chicago community began to whisper about the steady stream of young girls seen visiting his mansion, often driven there in luxury cars with tinted windows. Teachers reported to parents that their students boasted about hanging out with R. Kelly. But when concerned adults tried to press the issue, they were met with shrugs or dismissals. After all, this was R. Kelly, the superstar who had put Chicago's music scene on the map. To question him was to risk sounding jealous or cynical. Investigators still question whether police departments and school officials deliberately downplayed early concerns because of his celebrity status. Then there were the settlements. A few young women, or in some cases their families, quietly accused Kelly of sexual misconduct. Court filings were made, but cases disappeared into confidential agreements, sealed with non-disclosure clauses and large sums of money. Each time one of these stories surfaced, it was quickly buried. The media occasionally caught wind, but editors weighed the risk of lawsuits against the strength of rumors. Headlines vanished, and the public heard nothing more. In hindsight, these moments look like flashing red lights. At the time, they were treated as background noise. Here's a quirky detail that history now finds chilling. Kelly often hung around Kenwood Academy, the Chicago high school he once attended. Even after achieving fame, he returned to the campus, hanging near the gates, talking to students. To outsiders, it seemed like a local hero reconnecting with his roots. But former classmates later admitted it was an open secret. Kelly was known for picking up teenage girls from the very school where his career had begun. What seemed harmless to some now reads like a warning written in neon. The larger culture of the 1990s also played a role. This was the decade when tabloid scandals filled grocery store checkout aisles, but serious conversations about abuse of power in the entertainment industry were rare. The internet was still young, so victims lacked the platforms to amplify their stories. Without social media to rally support, accusations could vanish in a single news cycle. In contrast, Kelly's music videos played constantly on MTV and BET, embedding him deeper into mainstream adoration. You can help but think about how differently the story might have unfolded if even one of these early allegations had been pursued more aggressively. Police had opportunities, journalists had leads, executives had reasons to ask questions, and yet no one did. Each time, the machine of fame kept rolling, and those who tried to speak up were drowned out. It was easier to dismiss the voices of young women as unreliable than to confront the possibility that a beloved star was committing crimes. Investigators still question whether Kelly's team deliberately cultivated this protective silence. His inner circle, bodyguards, assistants, even tour managers, appeared to help maintain a facade of innocence. Some reportedly arranged travel, hotel rooms, and introductions, ensuring he always had access to vulnerable young women. Later, court testimony painted a picture not of a lone predator, but of a system built to enable him. And yet, during those years, the machinery of denial kept running smoothly, its gears greased by money, fear, and fame. It wasn't just those inside the industry who ignored the alarms. Fans played their part too. Every time whispers grew, Kelly would release another hit record and the conversation would shift. Songs like I Believe I Can Fly and Ignition Remix became cultural events, used in movies, sports events, and weddings. How could someone who wrote such uplifting music also be dangerous? The contradiction was too uncomfortable to face, so the warnings faded into the background once again. Looking back, it's almost surreal. The signs were everywhere, but no one wanted to read them. It's like standing at a railroad crossing where the lights are flashing, the bell is ringing, but people keep walking across the tracks because the train isn't visible yet. You know now that the train was coming, and it would hit with devastating force. By the late 1990s, these ignored warnings had set the stage for what came next. A marriage that stunned the industry, a scandal that could no longer be silenced, and the first real crack in the superstar's untouchable image. The alarms had been sounding for years. No one listened. Now, the noise was about to get impossible to ignore. You arrive in the year 1994, a year that should have marked only the continued rise of an R&B giant. R. Kelly was fresh off the success of 12 Play, his music dominating radio waves, his reputation as a hitmaker expanding. But instead of headlines about chart-topping singles, whispers turned into a roar when news broke of his secret marriage to Aaliyah. She was a rising star herself, his young protege, barely 15 years old. The marriage certificate, obtained through fraudulent means, falsely listed her age as 18. What might have been dismissed as rumor suddenly crystallized into shocking proof. One of music, as most celebrated men had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. The marriage lasted only a few months before it was annulled, but the damage lingered. Fans were stunned, industry insiders uncomfortable, and critics began to ask how such a thing could have happened in plain sight. You can feel the collective unease of that moment, a mix of disbelief and denial. It was easier for many to chalk it up to showbiz drama than to confront the underlying horror of a grown man marrying a child. Investigators still question whether powerful record executives actively smoothed over the scandal, ensuring it wouldn't derail Kelly's career at its peak. In court documents years later, Aaliyah was referred to simply as Jane Doe Sue 1. That choice was not only a legal necessity but also a chilling reminder of how her story, like so many others, was tucked away in anonymity, even as her fame grew. And though her marriage to Kelly was annulled, the whispers about his attraction to underage girls only grew louder. Yet once again, Kelly's fame acted like a shield. He kept releasing music, kept performing, kept climbing the ladder of success. It was as if the world collectively decided to look away. Here's a quirky detail. According to reports, the marriage license was obtained in Illinois by bribing a government employee with cash. That single act of fraud, a forged document slipped through official channels, enabled a marriage that never should have existed. Years later, prosecutors would use that bribery charge as part of the racketeering case that finally brought Kelly down. What seemed like a minor act of paperwork fraud at the time would become a crucial thread in unraveling his empire. The scandal of the Aaliyah marriage stands as one of the earliest moments when Kelly's behavior was undeniable. But instead of leading to accountability, it became a cultural footnote, a strange anecdote overshadowed by Aaliyah's later success and tragic death. The public forgot. The industry forgot. Kelly, meanwhile, learned a dangerous lesson. He could cross boundaries, even in the full glare of the spotlight, and survive. This moment also reveals something about the culture of the 1990s. Celebrity worship often outweighed moral outrage. Tabloids thrived on scandal, but they also trivialized it, packaging serious issues as entertainment. In Kelly's case, the scandal became gossip fodder, not a catalyst for change, and Aaliyah herself, just beginning her career, rarely spoke publicly about what had happened, choosing silence that some say was imposed by contracts, pressure, and a desire to move forward. Investigators still question whether law enforcement should have intervened more decisively at that moment. After all, the marriage certificate was public record. The annulment, too, was a matter of legal fact. But no criminal charges were ever pursued. No meaningful consequences followed. Instead, the industry doubled down on protecting one of its most profitable stars. For Aaliyah, the story faded into the background as her career blossomed, only to end in tragedy when she died in a plane crash in 2001. For Kelly, it was another scandal survived, another test of boundaries passed without punishment. The truth, though, is that this marriage marked the beginning of a pattern that would repeat for decades. Victims too young to fight back, an industry unwilling to confront uncomfortable truths, and a star who believed himself untouchable. Each ignored warning made him bolder, each escape from accountability more dangerous. The story of Aaliyah and R. Kelly wasn't just a scandal. It was a prophecy of worse to come. By the end of 1994, the marriage was annulled, but the echoes lingered. Kelly's songs kept climbing charts, his concerts kept selling out, and his reputation, though slightly dented, remained intact. But if you listen closely, you can hear the cracks beginning to form. For those who dared to look past the glitter, it was clear. The dark secret was no longer hiding. It was standing right in front of everyone, waiting to be seen. You find yourself in the early 2000s, when R. Kelly's carefully maintained image began to fracture in ways that could no longer be smoothed over with hit songs or settlement checks. It started with a videotape, grainy, disturbing, and widely circulated, that prosecutors claimed showed Kelly engaged in sexual acts with a girl who appeared to be underage. The tape surfaced like a lightning strike, impossible to ignore, and for the first time, the star's denials faced something that looked unshakably real. The tape was first given anonymously to a Chicago reporter in 2002. Almost overnight, it spread like wildfire through bootleg markets, whispered conversations, and even late-night talk shows. In those days, before smartphones and social media, physical copies of a scandal were rare. And yet, here it was, burned onto DVDs, whispered about in barbershops, traded in high schools. You can imagine the surreal scene. Fans clutching the very evidence that could land their idol in prison. Investigators still question whether the leak was accidental, malicious, or even orchestrated to force accountability that the system had long avoided. Kelly denied it was him on the tape. His lawyers claimed the video was doctored, that lookalikes were being used, that the technology wasn't reliable enough to make a definitive identification. But the imagery was hard to dispute. Law enforcement eventually charged him with multiple counts of child pornography, finally pulling the star into the courtroom spotlight. The walls of denial seemed to be crumbling. Here's a quirky detail. Despite the seriousness of the allegations, bootleg vendors reportedly saw a spike in profits, with the tape being sold openly on city streets like a hot new album. It was both grotesque and absurd, a criminal trial unfolding in public, while the evidence was treated as contraband entertainment. This bizarre intersection of crime, celebrity, and street culture highlighted just how deeply Kelly's story had embedded itself into American life. Meanwhile, the cultural backdrop was shifting. The early 2000s saw the explosion of reality TV, shock jock radio, and gossip websites, all eager to feed off scandal. But with R. Kelly, the story wasn't just scandal, it was crime, plain and simple. And yet, despite the severity, the public's reaction was split. Some fans stood by him fiercely, insisting he was being targeted because of his success as a black artist. Others quietly admitted the evidence was too damning to ignore. But even then, radio stations kept playing his songs, and his concerts remained packed. The contradiction was everywhere, outrage coexisting with adoration. Investigators still question whether jurors and fans alike were swayed by the sheer weight of his celebrity. In an era before cancel culture became a phrase, the idea of cutting ties with an icon felt unthinkable. For many, the music and the man were inseparable, and they weren't ready to give up the soundtrack of their lives, no matter how disturbing the allegations became. For Kelly himself, the tape represented both danger and opportunity. His defense strategy leaned into delay, stretching proceedings across years, filing motions, and exploiting every loophole available. By dragging out the process, his lawyers hoped witnesses would become less credible, memories less reliable, and public outrage less intense. And to a degree, it worked. The trial didn't begin until 2008, 6 years after the tape surfaced. 6 years in which Kelly released albums, toured the world, and even launched new hits. It was as if the scandal existed in a parallel universe, separate from the stage lights. But you can't ignore the impact of the tape on the survivors who saw it. For them, it wasn't abstract. It wasn't gossip. It was a brutal confirmation of what they had been trying to tell the world. Every time the video circulated, it was another wound, another reminder of how their pain had become public spectacle. By the time the trial date was set, the tape had become infamous, etched into pop culture history. It was no longer just about one superstar's fall from grace. It was about how society itself handled abuse allegations against the rich and powerful. Would the courts finally do what the whispers and warnings had failed to achieve? Or would the system, once again, bend to the power of celebrity? As you move closer to the 2008 trial, the question hangs heavy. If justice was ever going to be served, this was the moment. The tape had shown the world something undeniable. The question was whether anyone in power was willing to act on it. You move into the year 2008, when after 6 years of delays, adjournments, and legal maneuvering, R. Kelly finally stood trial. The charges stemmed from that now infamous videotape, the one prosecutors said showed him engaging in sexual acts with a girl who was as young as 14. This was supposed to be the moment when the wall of denial crumbled, the reckoning that survivors had waited years to see. Instead, what unfolded became one of the most controversial acquittals in modern music history. The trial was held in Chicago, the city that had both birthed Kelly's career and protected him for years. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, some waving signs of support, others demanding justice. Inside, the prosecution laid out its case. They argued the tape clearly showed Kelly, and the girl's age made it a crime beyond question. The defense countered with an aggressive campaign of doubt, insisting the tape was too blurry, too unreliable, and that the girl in question denied she was the one in the video. Without her testimony, prosecutors struggled to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. You can picture the tension in that courtroom. Jurors leaning forward, squinting at grainy footage played on bulky courtroom TVs. Lawyers pacing back and forth, hammering the same points. Investigators still question whether jurors felt intimidated by the sheer weight of Kelly's fame, or whether they simply didn't want to be responsible for sending a beloved musician to prison. Whatever the reason, when the verdict was read, not guilty on all counts, Kelly walked free. Here's a quirky detail. In the days after his acquittal, Kelly released a song called Victory, as though framing the trial as just another obstacle overcome, another mountain climbed. Fans at concerts cheered louder than ever, celebrating not just his music but his ability to beat the system. In some corners of Chicago, the verdict was treated less like a legal outcome and more like a sports championship, celebrated in barbershops and clubs as though a hometown hero had scored the winning goal. The acquittal was devastating for survivors and advocates. Many felt betrayed by the justice system, as though the evidence hadn't mattered. Activists warned that the verdict would embolden Kelly, making him feel invincible. They were right. Freed from the weight of a guilty verdict, Kelly returned to touring, recording, and enjoying the luxuries of celebrity life. The message seemed clear. No matter the allegations, the superstar could not be stopped. This moment also reveals something larger about the cultural landscape of the late 2000s. Discussions about sexual abuse, particularly involving celebrities, were often minimized or dismissed. The Me Too movement was still years away, and many survivors felt isolated, their voices easily drowned out. In that environment, Kelly thrived, leaning on loyal fans and a powerful legal team to shield him from accountability. Investigators still question whether jurors privately believed Kelly was guilty but lacked the courage to convict without the direct testimony of the girl. The defense's strategy had worked: create just enough doubt, emphasize the lack of cooperation from the alleged victim, and rely on the high burden of proof required in criminal trials. The result? A superstar walked away smiling, while survivors left the courthouse feeling invisible. Yet beneath the surface, the acquittal didn't erase the growing pile of allegations. Journalists continued to investigate, insiders whispered, and more women slowly began to come forward. Kelly's freedom may have given him a public win, but it also deepened the determination of those who wanted the truth exposed. Looking back, this 2008 trial feels like a tragic fork in the road. The justice system had its chance to stop him, and it didn't. Instead, Kelly was emboldened. He doubled down on his control, on his secrecy, and on the machinery of enablers who helped him hide in plain sight. For fans, the acquittal became a license to keep enjoying the music guilt-free. For survivors, it became proof that the fight for justice would be long, painful, and uphill. As you step out of that Chicago courtroom and into the next chapter of this story, you can feel the weight of the missed opportunity. The system had looked directly at the evidence and blinked. And now, what could have ended here was only just beginning. You move past the 2008 acquittal and step into the strange twilight of R. Kelly's career, when his public image seemed untouchable despite the shadow of scandal. Freed from the threat of prison, he reinvented himself once again, doubling down on his role as the Pied Piper of R&B. Fans poured into arenas, sang along to every lyric, and treated him less like a man accused of horrific crimes and more like a living legend. For Kelly, this wasn't survival. It was triumph. He leaned into it, crafting an almost mythic narrative of persecution and resilience, as if he were the victim who had risen above unfair attacks. During this period, his creativity flourished in ways that seemed almost surreal. He embarked on his sprawling Trapped in the Closet project, a series of musical chapters that blurred the line between soap opera, theater, and parody. With each installment, audiences laughed, gossiped, and shared the clips online. It became a pop culture phenomenon, endlessly parodied on Saturday Night Live and late-night TV. But beneath the humor lay a darker irony. While people were entertained by his outrageous fictional tales of infidelity and secrets, his real-life abuses remained hidden in plain sight. Here was a quirky detail. Kelly often performed shows where he brought women from the audience onto the stage, serenading them, sometimes even handing out roses. Fans describe how electric those moments felt, an almost hypnotic blend of intimacy and spectacle. Yet, in hindsight, those theatrics mirrored the very manipulation survivors would later describe: the charm, the flattery, the control disguised as romance. Investigators still question why the world was so quick to laugh at Trapped in the Closet, but so slow to take the allegations seriously. Was it because the music was too good? Because society wasn't ready to confront the ugliness of sexual abuse, especially when committed by a superstar? Or was it that fans simply didn't want to lose the soundtrack to their weddings, their parties, their memories? Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the machine kept running. Kelly's entourage allegedly worked like a fortress: drivers, managers, assistants, all accused in later reports of shielding him, recruiting young women, and silencing those who might speak out. Hotels, studios, and tour buses became his private domain, spaces where, according to survivors, rules were enforced and freedoms restricted. On stage, he was a playful showman. Off stage, he was allegedly a controlling abuser. This disconnect between public persona and private reality grew wider with each passing year. Kelly would grant occasional interviews, dismissing allegations with a mix of arrogance and charm. In one moment, he'd flash that wide smile. In another, he'd shift the blame to jealous rivals, bitter exes, or opportunistic reporters. Many in the media played along, hesitant to push too hard for fear of losing access to the star. The culture of the late 2000s and early 2010s made it easy for him to thrive. Social media was just beginning to reshape the celebrity landscape, and Kelly's scandals existed in fragments. An article here, yet a whisper there, never fully coalescing into the viral outrage we later see in the Sheiker's Me Too era. Fans could easily compartmentalize, listen to the music, laugh at the jokes, and ignore the rest. Yet cracks were forming. Grassroots activists, particularly black women in Chicago, were raising their voices louder. Organizations like Now Mute R. Kelly began demanding accountability, urging radio stations to stop playing his music in venues to cancel his shows. Their fight was slow, often ignored, but it planted seeds. These women understood something the courts had missed, that justice wouldn't come from the system unless the culture demanded it first. By this time, Kelly's empire had become a paradox, thriving on stage, toxic off it, fueled by denial, enablers, and a public that wasn't ready to confront the truth. But, as history would show, this fragile balance couldn't last forever, because while Kelly sang about closets full of secrets in his music, the real secrets were piling up, and eventually the doors would be forced open. You now arrive in the mid-2010s, when the fortress around R. Kelly began to crack in ways that could no longer be ignored. For years, the singer had managed to sidestep consequences, but culture was shifting, and the patience of both the public and the press was wearing thin. The whispers that once floated in Chicago barbershops and among industry insiders were turning into headlines on national platforms. Journalists were circling back to the old allegations, asking why nothing had been done, and new survivors were stepping forward, determined not to be silenced. One of the pivotal moments came in 2017 with the explosive BuzzFeed News investigation by reporter Jim DeRogatis, the same journalist who had first received the videotape years earlier. This time, the allegations centered on what was described as a sex cult. Parents claimed their daughters had been groomed and cut off from their families, living under Kelly's control in suburban mansions where their movements and choices were strictly regulated. The image was chilling. Young women isolated, cut off from loved ones, and allegedly manipulated into obedience under the guise of mentorship and love. Here's a quirky detail. In the days after the article went live, reporters described seeing parents holding protests outside Kelly's concerts, begging for their daughters back. Fans waiting in line often ignored them, some even taunting the families with chants of "Free R. Kelly." The concerts went on, but the energy was changing, no longer carefree but laced with unease. Investigators still question why, despite such serious allegations, Kelly was able to keep touring, keep performing, and keep profiting. The answer lies partly in the legal gray zone of consent. Most of the women involved were over 18, which made the accusations harder to prosecute. But it also speaks to the power of celebrity and the unwillingness of the industry to cut ties until absolutely forced to. At the same time, activists were getting louder. The Mute R. Kelly movement gained traction, particularly in Kelly's hometown of Chicago and in cities where he continued to book shows. Social media amplified their message in ways that hadn't been possible a decade earlier. Hashtags, viral videos, and survivor testimonies began to spread faster than Kelly's team could control. Radio stations quietly dropped his music, and venues began reconsidering whether to host his performances. For the first time, his career faced real financial consequences. Kelly, true to form, responded with defiance. He posted videos mocking his critics, dismissing the allegations as lies, and insisting he was the victim of a witch hunt. In interviews, he oscillated between calm denials and erratic outbursts. His team released statements painting the women as willing participants, eager to be with a superstar, but these defenses rang increasingly hollow. The tide of public opinion was shifting, and Kelly could no longer rely on blind loyalty to shield him. This was also the era when cultural conversations about abuse and power were reaching a boiling point. The Dr. Me Too movement exploded in 2017, exposing predators across industries, from Hollywood moguls to politicians. Suddenly, survivors were being believed in ways they hadn't before. In that climate, the allegations against R. Kelly no longer seemed like isolated scandals. They were part of a larger pattern of abuse of power. And then came the cultural earthquake, the 2019 Surviving R. Kelly documentary series. Survivors spoke on camera in harrowing detail about their experiences. Stories of grooming, coercion, and captivity that echoed one another with chilling consistency. The world was no longer laughing at "trapped in the closet." Instead, they were horrified by the real-life closets these women described, the ones filled with silence, fear, and pain. The impact was immediate. Streaming numbers plummeted, protests grew larger, and prosecutors finally reopened investigations that had long been dormant. Kelly's once protected world was collapsing. What had been whispers for decades was now a roar. Looking back, this turning point feels like the inevitable unraveling of a carefully constructed illusion. For years, Kelly had thrived on doubt, denial, and the loyalty of fans. But when survivors' voices united, amplified by activists and media, the truth could no longer be contained. The Pied Piper had run out of places to hide. You step into the aftermath of Surviving R. Kelly, when the illusion finally shattered and the walls closed in. The documentary didn't just retell allegations, it forced the world to look, to listen, and to reckon with decades of ignored voices. Survivors appeared on camera with names, faces, and tears, no longer anonymous whispers in court documents or background chatter in tabloids. Their testimony carried a raw power that courtroom transcripts never could. Millions watched, horrified, and suddenly the question wasn't whether R. Kelly was guilty. It was how he had gotten away with it for so long. The cultural shift was seismic. Radio stations scrubbed his tracks from playlists. Streaming platforms pulled his songs from official recommendations, and longtime collaborators rushed to distance themselves. Artists who once admired or worked with him now condemned him. For the first time in his career, Kelly's music wasn't enough to save him. The man who had written global anthems for weddings, graduations, and celebrations was now synonymous with predation and abuse. Here's a quirky detail. At one of Kelly's final concerts before his arrest, fans noticed that the crowd was split in a way they'd never seen before. Half cheered as though nothing had changed, while the other half stood silently, phones raised, capturing his every move like witnesses at a trial. It was no longer entertainment. It was evidence. Investigators seized the momentum. Prosecutors in multiple states began revisiting cold files and opening new cases. Federal authorities launched investigations into trafficking, child pornography, and racketeering. Kelly's longtime inner circle began to fracture. Managers, assistants, and associates once loyal to him now faced subpoenas, and some began cooperating with the government. The protective shield he had relied on for decades was gone. And then came the infamous interview. In March 2019, R. Kelly sat down with journalist Gayle King in what was supposed to be his chance to tell his side of the story. Instead, it became a viral spectacle. Kelly erupted in anger, shouting, crying, pounding his fists, standing over King in a rage while she sat calm and unmoved. The clip spread across the world. A man unraveling under the weight of his own lies live on television. To many, it wasn't just a meltdown. It was a mask slipping. The charm, the composure, the denial, all crumbled in front of millions. From there, the fall was swift. In July 2019, Kelly was arrested on federal charges in Chicago, accused of running what prosecutors described as a criminal enterprise that recruited, groomed, and exploited underage girls for decades. The indictment read like the script of a horror story. racketeering, child exploitation, kidnapping, forced labor. Charges stacked up in Illinois, New York, and Minnesota. For the first time, the justice system appeared unwilling to let him slip through its fingers. Meanwhile, survivors watched the spectacle with a mix of vindication and pain. Some said they finally felt seen after decades of being dismissed. Others admitted the process reopened old wounds, forcing them to relive trauma in the public eye. But their courage had sparked a reckoning, not just for R. Kelly, but for the music industry, the legal system, and a culture that had allowed him to thrive for so long. By the end of 2019, it was clear that the man who once saw himself as untouchable was facing the reality of prison. The narrative had shifted from, "Can he survive this?" to, "How long will he be locked away?" The fall of the Pied Piper wasn't just a scandal. It was a cultural turning point, a moment when silence finally gave way to truth. You step into the courtroom in Chicago, 2022, where a separate but equally damning trial unfolds: the federal child pornography and sexual exploitation case. This time, the focus isn't just on one videotape or one survivor. It is an entire pattern of predation spanning years, multiple states, and dozens of victims. Federal prosecutors meticulously lay out how Kelly allegedly manipulated, coerced, and recorded young women for his own sexual gratification, creating what the government called a pyramid of abuse. Each piece of evidence, each witness testimony, builds a mosaic of systemic exploitation that can no longer be dismissed. From the outside, the trial appears almost cinematic. Lawyers argue, jurors take notes, and spectators fill the gallery, some whispering, some shaking their heads. Investigators still question how Kelly's operations remained so hidden for so long, despite the thousands of interactions he had with young fans, employees, and protégés. The courtroom, once a distant abstract in news reports, now becomes a stage for history, with survivors telling their stories directly to the men and women tasked with delivering justice. Here's a quirky detail. During the trial, jurors reportedly noticed Kelly frequently tapping his foot and smirking during some testimonies, behaviors that lawyers later claimed were attempts to intimidate witnesses or display disbelief. Whatever the intention, it underscored the dissonance between his public persona as a superstar entertainer and the grim allegations being examined. The legal strategy on both sides is intense. The defense leans heavily on challenging credibility, emphasizing memory lapses and framing interactions as consensual once women reached adulthood. The prosecution, meanwhile, ties together the evidence like a chain, connecting financial records, hotel logs, and video footage to establish a sustained criminal enterprise. For observers, the contrast is stark. One side arguing freedom, the other methodically exposing decades of abuse. As the trial progresses, a pattern emerges. Kelly allegedly controlled every aspect of his victims' lives. According to court testimony, he dictated where they lived, who they could speak to, and even their diet and wardrobe. Survivors described a system designed to isolate them, creating dependency and fear. While he was performing on stage and recording music, Kelly's alleged exploitation continued behind closed doors, carefully shielded by loyal staff and the indifference of an industry reluctant to intervene. Investigators still question why law enforcement didn't act sooner, given the similarities between these cases and the earlier 2008 and 2019 allegations. Some argue that only the combination of survivor bravery, social media amplification, and investigative journalism made the convictions possible. Kelly's past victories in court may have made him complacent, believing he could manipulate the system yet again. Despite the tension, moments of human emotion break through. Survivors testify with courage, sometimes breaking down as they recount their experiences. Their stories vary, but the theme is consistent: control, coercion, and a pattern of abuse spanning years. Jurors listen intently. weighing each word, each piece of evidence, each recorded interaction. This is the moment where decades of silence collide with the possibility of accountability. By the end of the trial, the evidence is overwhelming. Kelly is found guilty on multiple counts, including child pornography, sexual exploitation, and racketeering. The verdict represents a stark reversal from 2008, a long-delayed justice for those who had fought to be heard for decades. The superstar, who once seemed untouchable, now faces the full consequences of his actions, proving that persistence, bravery, and exposure can overcome even the most powerful shield of fame. You enter the sentencing phase, where the weight of R. Kelly's actions finally meets the consequences of the law. In June 2022, the court handed down a federal sentence of 30 years in prison, a term reflecting the severity of decades-long abuse and the lasting impact on survivors. This wasn't just a number. It was a symbolic statement that no amount of fame or fortune could place someone above accountability. The courtroom was tense, the atmosphere thick with the gravity of what had transpired, and survivors, families, and advocates watched as justice, long delayed, was finally served. Kelly's demeanor in court was subdued, a stark contrast to his earlier outbursts. For decades, he had relied on charm, manipulation, and public adoration to navigate allegations. Now, those tools were powerless. The sentence was designed not only to punish but to protect, ensuring he could no longer operate the networks of coercion that had defined his later years. Investigators still question whether any future legal proceedings could add to the sentence, or clarify additional alleged crimes that remain under investigation in other jurisdictions. Here's a quirky detail. During the sentencing, Kelly's legal team asked the judge for leniency, highlighting his musical contributions and charitable work. It seemed almost surreal. In a room filled with testimonies of trauma, they attempted to frame decades of abuse as a footnote to artistry. The request was quickly dismissed, emphasizing that fame does not excuse criminal behavior. The reaction outside the courthouse was powerful and emotional. Survivors wept openly, some holding hands with those who had testified alongside them, while advocates gave speeches to the assembled press about systemic failures that allowed Kelly A.'s abuses to continue for decades. Across social media, users celebrated the long-overdue justice, but also reflected on the years of silence and inaction that had allowed Kelly to thrive. This phase also reveals the broader implications of his sentence. For the music industry, it was a wake-up call, a demonstration that overlooking predatory behavior in pursuit of profit could have severe consequences. Radio stations and streaming platforms that had already removed his music now faced scrutiny about why they had continued to promote him during periods of active investigation. The ripple effect extended beyond the courtroom, reshaping how labels, managers, and promoters approach allegations of misconduct. Investigators still question whether Kelly fully understands the magnitude of the sentence and its impact on his legacy. Once celebrated as the king of R&B, he now faces decades behind bars, his reputation irrevocably damaged, and his music forever linked to trauma. For survivors, this moment is bittersweet. A long-awaited acknowledgement of their suffering, but also a reminder of the years stolen by silence and inaction. Kelly's sentence also includes financial penalties and supervised release conditions following incarceration, ensuring that restitution and monitoring continue beyond the prison walls. It is a comprehensive effort to both punish and prevent further abuse, designed to acknowledge the lasting harm done to multiple generations of victims. As you reflect on the courtroom, the sentence, and the lives affected, it becomes clear that accountability, while long overdue, can be achieved. The R&B superstar who once captivated audiences with his voice now serves as a cautionary tale about the dangerous intersections of fame, power, and unchecked predation. The sentence is final, the future immutable, and the message unmistakable. No one, not even a legend, is above the law. You enter the reflective period following R. Kelly's convictions and sentencing, where the cultural and personal repercussions continue to unfold. The legal battles may have ended, but the emotional and social reverberations are ongoing. Survivors are navigating life after decades of trauma, some finding a renewed sense of justice, others still grappling with the scars left by years of manipulation and abuse. The public, meanwhile, is left reconciling the art they once loved with the man behind the crimes, a complicated tension that forces society to ask uncomfortable questions about the separation of artist and actions. The media's role in shaping perception becomes impossible to ignore. The surviving R. Kelly documentaries, news coverage, and social media campaigns provided a platform for survivors that the courts alone could not. The narratives shifted from speculation to testimony, from rumor to evidence. You can feel the change in discourse. Conversations that were once whispered in private now dominate public consciousness, challenging fans and cultural commentators to reckon with the depth and breadth of the abuse. Investigators still question whether previous generations of reporters and executives could have acted sooner, potentially preventing years of harm. Here's a quirky detail. Despite the notoriety, Kelly's music has not entirely disappeared from private collections and streaming playlists. Some listeners cite nostalgia or artistic separation as reasons, creating a strange dichotomy where appreciation for his musical talent coexists with condemnation of his personal actions. It's a reminder that culture often struggles to reconcile beauty and horror, and that survivors' voices can sometimes be drowned out by the comfort of memory. Legal scholars and advocacy groups have used the Kelly cases as a template for reform. Discussions now center on how to better protect minors and vulnerable individuals, improve reporting mechanisms, and ensure that celebrity status cannot insulate perpetrators from accountability. The ripple effects are evident. Higher scrutiny in the entertainment industry, more responsive social media oversight, and the growth of survivor-centered advocacy organizations that demand transparency and justice. For Kelly himself, prison is both a literal and symbolic isolation. No longer able to manipulate systems or charm crowds, he confronts the consequences of decades-long abuse. His legacy is irrevocably tarnished, his influence on the industry overshadowed by his crimes. Investigators still question whether any remaining accomplices or enablers will face accountability, as the cases have exposed a network that allowed him to operate unchecked for years. On a societal level, the case catalyzed broader reflection on the structures that enable abuse. Parents, fans, and industry professionals alike were forced to confront uncomfortable realities. Power dynamics, silence, and the glamorization of fame can create environments where predators thrive. In acknowledging these failures, society begins to recognize the importance of vigilance, empathy, and proactive protection of the vulnerable. Finally, the survivors' stories, once ignored or buried, now serve as a beacon. Their courage transformed decades of inaction into a movement for accountability. They have redefined what it means to speak out, to persist, and to demand justice. Their voices continue to educate, inspire, and warn, ensuring that while Kelly's crimes may be part of history, the lessons learned extend into the future. You arrive at the final section of this long, painful story, where the full weight of R. Kelly's actions, his convictions, and the societal reckoning converge. By now, the narrative is clear. Decades of predation, manipulation, and abuse finally meet accountability through the courts, media exposure, and survivor courage. The superstar who once seemed untouchable is now a convicted felon, serving decades behind bars, stripped of the protective aura of fame that once shielded him. But the story doesn't end with the prison sentence. It continues in the lives of those affected, the cultural conversation it sparked, and the lessons learned. The survivor's resilience is central to this chapter. Many have begun rebuilding their lives, finding strength in advocacy, therapy, and community. Their experiences highlight a crucial truth. While legal justice is essential, healing is ongoing. Some have become activists, using their platforms to educate others about grooming, coercion, and the systemic failures that allowed Kelly to operate for so long. Investigators still question whether all survivors will ever see full restitution, but their courage has forever changed how abuse is addressed in the entertainment industry. Here's a quirky detail. Despite decades of allegations, Kelly's music continues to appear in online conversations, not in mainstream channels, but in niche communities dissecting pop culture history. It's a reminder of how art and artist can be uncomfortably intertwined, and how society struggles to fully reject something once it was celebrated. The music, once a soundtrack to joy, now serves as a haunting echo of a hidden darkness. The legal and cultural implications of Kelly's fall extend beyond him. The industry has been forced to examine its complicity, from managers and label executives to media outlets and venues. The Not Corey Mute R. Kelly movement demonstrated the power of public accountability, while prosecutors' persistence showed that even high-profile predators could be stopped with enough evidence and courage. These lessons ripple outward, influencing how future allegations are treated and how victims are supported. Investigators still question the full extent of Kelly A.S. network and whether others who enabled his behavior will face justice. The cases revealed layers of enablers, assistants, drivers, managers, who facilitated access to vulnerable young women. Some have been charged, others have yet to face consequences. The story is a stark reminder that predators often do not act alone. They rely on networks willing to protect them at the expense of others. Finally, you reflect on the broader societal message. Kelly's story exposes the danger of fame unchecked by accountability, the harm caused when systems ignore warning signs, and the power of survivor voices when they unite and persist. It is a cautionary tale, but also a testament to resilience, to persistence, and to the pursuit of justice even after decades of silence. The world learned painfully that talent and success do not excuse abuse, and that ultimately no one is beyond the reach of justice. The story of R. Kelly, the R&B superstar, and his dark secret is now a chapter in cultural history, a narrative of fame, manipulation, silence, courage, and finally, reckoning. Survivors' voices endure, reminding everyone that truth can no longer be hidden in closets and that persistence and exposure are the paths to accountability. The music may linger, but so too does the lesson. Vigilance, empathy, and justice must always prevail. As you let this story settle, you feel the weight of decades of abuse, silence, and delayed justice. It's a heavy reflection, a reminder that fame can mask harm and that the voices of the vulnerable often go unheard until they are amplified by courage and persistence. Listening closely, you notice the resilience threaded through the narratives of survivors, their determination to speak, to confront, and to reclaim agency in a world that once ignored them. The impact of R. Kelly's convictions extends far beyond one individual. It reshapes how society, the entertainment industry, and legal systems understand and confront abuse. There's an eerie duality here. Music that brought joy and inspiration exists alongside a reality that was painful, exploitative, and criminal. This tension is difficult to hold, yet it underscores a fundamental lesson. Art and artist are not always inseparable, and society must critically examine the people we elevate, even when their talent dazzles. The story also highlights the role of media, activists, and survivors themselves in ensuring accountability. Without relentless reporting, public pressure, and bravery from those who suffered, Kelly may have continued unchallenged, his dark secret hidden behind fame. Now, as the chapter closes, you carry both unease and hope. Unease at the scale of the harm and the years it took for justice to arrive. Hope in the courage that finally broke through. The survivors' voices, amplified and heard, serve as a lasting reminder that truth cannot remain silent forever. The world has seen the consequences of unchecked power, and lessons have been learned. It is a quiet, reflective moment, a time to acknowledge the pain, honor the resilience, and commit to vigilance in the future.